Have you ever felt a sudden silence after closeness? One moment he was fully present, breathing beside you, eyes soft, defenses down. And then, like a shadow retreating from light, he disappeared. No words, no explanation, just distance where intimacy once lived. But what if I told you that his retreat isn't about rejection, but reflection? What if that silence after intimacy, the one that leaves you questioning everything, is exactly what makes you unforgettable? What if the answer isn't in what you said or didn't say, but in something much deeper that Jung called the meeting of souls? Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But here's what most people don't understand. Intimacy doesn't just involve bodies. It involves shadows, unconscious patterns, and memories buried so deep, we've forgotten they exist. For many men, especially those who've spent their lives performing strength, intimacy isn't a door to closeness. It's a mirror reflecting parts of themselves they've never learned to face. Parts that feel dangerous, vulnerable, too real for the armor they've worn since childhood. Jung understood that when two people truly connect, beyond the surface, beyond the masks, something profound happens in the unconscious. Ancient patterns awaken, old wounds surface, and suddenly, the very person who brought them peace becomes the one who forces them to confront what they've been running from their entire lives. Today, we'll uncover why men often retreat after the deepest moments of connection, and yet why something about you lingers in their psyche like an echo. They can't silence, not because of what you did wrong, but because of who you revealed yourself to be. Because in a world of performance and pretense, you offered something rare: authenticity. And authenticity, Jung knew, is both irresistible and terrifying. When a man withdraws after intimacy, the immediate impulse is to assume you did something wrong. Too much vulnerability. Not enough. Did you reveal too much of yourself, or not enough of what he needed? But the truth lives in a place most people never think to look, in the depths of what Jung called the shadow. We all carry a shadow, the repository of everything we've learned to hide, deny, or reject about ourselves. For many men, vulnerability, emotional openness, even the simple need to be truly seen, all of these live in the shadow. They were taught that these qualities were weaknesses, threats to the masculine identity they were supposed to embody. So when intimacy brings those buried parts to the surface, it doesn't feel like coming home. It feels like standing naked in a spotlight they never asked for. The retreat isn't personal, it's protective. Not because he stopped caring, but because he touched a part of himself he doesn't know how to integrate. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And you, in your stillness, in your non-demanding presence after he pulled away, you didn't chase, you reflected." That reflection is powerful, but it's also terrifying for someone who's never looked inward. Let me tell you about David, a 32-year-old architect who came to understand this pattern only after years of repeating it. Successful, confident, the kind of man who could navigate boardrooms and build relationships with ease. But after every intimate connection, he would retreat for days, sometimes weeks. "I felt like I was drowning," he later realized, "not in her presence, but in my own feelings. She didn't pressure me for anything, didn't demand explanations. But lying there beside her, I felt exposed, like she could see through decades of carefully constructed walls I didn't even know I'd built." David's retreat wasn't about the woman. It was about the unfamiliar territory of his own emotional landscape, a place he'd been conditioned to see as dangerous, feminine, weak. But her response, the way she didn't chase, didn't collapse into insecurity, but instead turned inward with dignity, that stayed with him. "I kept thinking about her calmness," he said. "How she didn't make my confusion about her worth. There was something about that silence that felt safe. Like maybe I could figure out what I was actually feeling without being judged for not knowing." Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. It's not your affection that makes you unforgettable. It's your absence, charged with dignity, not desperation. When you don't chase, when you don't break down into anxiety or manipulation, but instead turn inward with self-respect, you create something rare in his experience. Space, not empty space, but fertile space. Space for him to meet his own shadow without feeling like he's failing you in the process. Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." When you didn't chase but turned inward instead, you gave him permission to do the same. To wake up to parts of himself he'd been dreaming around for years. Most people, when faced with someone else's retreat, panic. They interpret silence as rejection, distance as disinterest. But what if the opposite were true? What if your ability to remain centered in your own worth, to not lose yourself in someone else's process, is exactly what makes you impossible to forget? Pause here and take a breath. Is this what you've been carrying all along? The belief that his retreat was evidence of your inadequacy rather than his awakening? In the days and weeks that follow his retreat, something happens in the unconscious that he may not even be aware of. His psyche begins to process not just the physical intimacy, but the emotional safety you created. The way you held space without suffocating it. The way you offered yourself without losing yourself. Jung believed the unconscious is always seeking balance, always moving toward what he called individuation, the process of becoming whole. And something about your response to his retreat signals to his unconscious that you might be someone who could support that journey rather than derail it. Most women, when faced with a man's post-intimacy retreat, respond from wounded ego or abandonment fears. They call, text, analyze, demand explanations. But when you respond from your center, from a place of understanding rather than urgency, you become associated in his unconscious not with pressure, but with peace. And peace, for a man who spent his life in performance mode, is rarer than you might imagine. Deep within every man's psyche lives what Jung called the anima, the unconscious feminine aspect of his personality. This isn't about gender roles. It's about the intuitive, emotional, receptive parts of human nature that many men learn to suppress or project onto women. Most men don't have conscious access to their anima. They feel its stirrings in moments of deep connection, in art that moves them, in glimpses of beauty that take their breath away. But they don't know how to integrate these experiences. So they project them outward, onto women who seem to embody what they cannot access alone. When you remained centered, after intimacy, not reactive, not manipulative, not demanding, but present, he experienced something profound, a glimpse of his own wholeness. Not just through you, but reflected back from the way you held yourself. He felt, perhaps for the first time, what it might be like to be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and connected. He may run from this feeling, but the feeling remains lodged in his psyche, like a seed that will eventually need to grow. Jung wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. What haunts him isn't your body, though the physical connection was meaningful. It's not even your words, though what you said may echo. What haunts him is the feeling of being seen, truly seen. without being judged, fixed, or demanded from. It wasn't just sex, it was recognition. And recognition, especially for someone who's spent years hiding behind personas, is both healing and destabilizing. It awakens parts of the self that have been dormant, and awakening always comes with growing pains, in quiet moments, while driving, before sleep. In the space between tasks, he finds himself remembering not just the physical intimacy, but the peace he felt beside you. The way his nervous system settled in your presence. The unfamiliar sensation of not having to perform, prove, or protect. Elena, a 29-year-old therapist, shared her experience with Marcus, a 34-year-old executive who retreated after what felt like the most connected night of her life. I had every instinct to text him, to bridge the silence with explanations or invitations, she said. But something deeper told me to wait. Instead of chasing, Elena turned to her journal, her meditation practice, her close friendships. She allowed herself to feel the disappointment without making it mean she was unworthy. She honored the beauty of what they'd shared without needing it to become something it wasn't ready to be. 6 weeks later, Marcus reached out. "I kept thinking about how peaceful I felt with you," he told her, "not just during our night together, but how you handled everything after. You didn't make my confusion about you. You just held space. I've never experienced that before." Elena's response had done something unexpected. It had shown Marcus what secure attachment could feel like. Not the anxious pursuit he was used to. Not the avoidant detachment he typically offered in return, but something steady and self-contained. Something that made him want to grow toward it rather than run away. What makes this dynamic so powerful, Jung would say, is that you're not just offering relationship, you're offering evolution. By not abandoning yourself when he retreats, you demonstrate a level of self-integration that his unconscious recognizes as rare and valuable. The echo that stays with him isn't about possession or conquest. It's about possibility, the possibility of connection without consumption, the possibility of intimacy without losing identity, the possibility of being loved for who he is, not who he performs to be. This echo lives in the spaces between his thoughts, in the moments when his defenses are down. It whispers questions he's never allowed himself to ask. What would it feel like to be known completely? What would it mean to love someone without losing himself? What would happen if he stopped running from his own heart? If this part hits something in you, keep going. The next few minutes might feel like looking in a mirror you've never seen before. Jung spoke of something he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to bridge conscious and unconscious, to integrate opposing forces within the self. Your response to his retreat, staying centered instead of chasing, loving yourself instead of abandoning yourself, activates this function in him. He begins to see that maybe vulnerability and strength aren't opposites. Maybe independence and connection can coexist. Maybe the very thing he's been running from, emotional intimacy, is exactly what his soul has been seeking. This isn't conscious at first. It's a deep, almost cellular recognition that shifts something in his foundation. The way you held yourself becomes a new reference point for what relationship could be. Not a place where he loses himself, but a place where he finds himself more completely. In the days and weeks that follow, when you stay rooted in your own essence, not waiting desperately, not breaking into pieces, but genuinely living your life, you become something extraordinary in his memory. You become proof that wholeness, is possible, because most people panic when faced with someone else's retreat. They chase, they explain, they try to fix what they assume is broken. They abandon their own center to rescue someone else's process. But you stayed with yourself, for yourself. and that silent self-respect echoes in him louder than any desperate message ever could. Jung understood that the journey toward individuation, becoming who we're truly meant to be, often requires periods of solitude, confusion, even seeming regression. By not interfering with his process, by not making his retreat about your worth, you honor something sacred in both of you. Your stillness, your ability to remain whole in the face of his fragmentation, forces him to confront questions he's never allowed himself to ask. Questions that arise not from guilt or pressure, but from genuine curiosity about what he experienced and why it felt so different from everything else. Why does her absence feel different from other people's presence? Why does the memory of being beside her feel more real than most of his actual daily experiences? What was it about that connection that felt like coming home to a place he'd never been before? Why, when he's with other people now, does he find himself comparing their energy to hers? Why do the women who chase him, who make themselves available at any hour, who seem to want him desperately, feel somehow less attractive than the one who didn't try to keep him? What was it about her response to his retreat that felt like safety rather than abandonment? How did she manage to make space for his confusion without making it about her failure? Why does he feel more like himself in her memory than he does in his current reality? These aren't comfortable questions for someone who's built his identity on certainty, control, and emotional invulnerability. But they're necessary questions for someone ready to grow beyond the limitations of his conditioning, someone ready to discover what lies beyond the walls he's built to keep himself safe. Your dignified response becomes a catalyst for his own self-examination, not because you demanded it, manipulated it, or strategized it, but because you demonstrated it. You showed him what it looks like to choose yourself without rejecting others, to love without losing yourself, to remain open without becoming empty. You became a living example of what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, remaining available without being desperate, caring without being consumed, loving without losing yourself in the process. Jung wrote extensively about what he called psychological types, and one thing he observed across all types was the magnetic pull of genuine self-possession. There's something deeply attractive about a person who doesn't need you to complete them, but chooses you to complement their already complete life. When you don't break down after his retreat, when you don't spiral into self-doubt or manipulative strategies, when you don't abandon your own life to focus obsessively on his absence, you demonstrate a level of emotional maturity that's rare in a world of reactive relationships. You show him what it might be like to love someone who doesn't lose herself in the process of loving him. This isn't about playing games or manufacturing scarcity or pretending not to care when you do. It's about being so grounded in your own worth that someone else's confusion doesn't destabilize your foundation. It's about having enough faith and genuine connection that you don't need to force it, chase it, or convince someone of its value. It's about understanding at a level deeper than strategy that anything you have to chase was never really yours to begin with, and anything that's meant for you won't require you to abandon yourself to keep it. Your self-possession in the face of his retreat creates what Jung might call a psychological vacuum. Not emptiness, but spaciousness, space for him to experience his own feelings without having to manage yours, space for him to miss you without feeling guilty about it, space for him to recognize what he had without feeling pressured to commit to it before he's ready. But here's what's most important. What matters more than whether he comes back or disappears forever? This process isn't really about him at all. It's about you remembering who you are when you're not performing for someone else's approval, when you're not contorting yourself to fit someone else's expectations, when you're not abandoning your own needs to meet someone else's. In the space his retreat creates, space that initially feels like loss but gradually reveals itself as opportunity, you Have a chance to fall back in love with your own life. To remember the interests that make you curious, the friendships that nourish you, the dreams that call to your soul without needing anyone's permission or validation. You get to practice being whole on your own terms, which is the greatest gift you can give yourself and any future relationship. You get to discover what it feels like to be chosen by someone who doesn't need you to be anything other than exactly who you are. Jung believed that the goal of life isn't to find your other half, but to become whole yourself and then to share that wholeness with someone else who has done the same work. When you use the time of his absence to deepen your relationship with yourself, you're not just waiting, you're evolving, you're becoming someone who can love from overflow rather than emptiness, someone who can offer presence rather than need, someone who can choose connection without losing yourself in it. Pause here for a moment of honest self-reflection. Ask yourself, what did this connection show you about who you're becoming? What parts of yourself came alive in his presence that you want to keep alive whether he returns or not? How can you honor the growth that happened through this experience, regardless of its outcome? What did his retreat teach you about your own patterns? Did you immediately move into rescue mode, trying to fix what you assumed was broken? Did you abandon your own life to focus on his absence? Or did you manage to stay centered in your own worth while still honoring what you shared? Jung saw every relationship as a mirror, reflecting back aspects of ourselves we might not see otherwise. Sometimes the gift isn't the person staying, it's the person showing us who we're capable of being when we're not hiding from our own depth, our own power, our own capacity for love. Write about this, not about him, but about you, about what you learned, what you're becoming, what you want to keep as you move forward. Your stillness after his retreat becomes a form of communication deeper than words, more powerful than any conversation could be. It says things that could never be said directly without sounding manipulative or strategic. I see you. I understand that connection can be overwhelming, especially for someone who's spent years avoiding emotional depth. I'm not going anywhere, but I'm also not waiting desperately. I trust what we shared enough to let it evolve naturally, or let it go gracefully, if that's what serves both of us. I don't need you to be anything other than exactly who you are, including confused, overwhelmed, or temporarily unavailable. I don't need you to have it all figured out before you can be in my life. I'm not here to fix you, change you, or convince you of anything. I'm here because something real happened between us, and real things don't need to be forced or chased or proven. They simply are, and they reveal themselves in their own time and their own way. This kind of response is so rare that it creates its own gravitational pull. Not the desperate pull of neediness, not the manipulative pull of strategy, but the gentle, irresistible pull of authentic love. Love that doesn't need anything from you to be complete, but chooses to include you because of who you are, not what you can provide. He may not understand it consciously, but his unconscious registers this as profound safety. Safety to be confused without being judged. Safety to process without pressure. Safety to return if and when he's ready, without having to rescue anyone or fix anything in the process. Safety to be human, imperfect, and still completely acceptable. What you're doing, choosing self-respect over self-abandonment, choosing presence over performance, choosing trust over terror, creates ripples that extend far beyond this one relationship. You're modeling for yourself and everyone around you what it looks like to love without losing yourself, to connect without consuming yourself, to remain open without becoming empty. You're proving that it's possible to care deeply without becoming desperate, to want someone without needing them to complete you, to love someone enough to let them have their process without making it about your worth. This modeling matters more than you might realize. Other people notice. They see how you handle uncertainty with grace, how you maintain your dignity when someone else is confused, how you love yourself enough not to abandon yourself for anyone. They begin to understand through your example that there's another way to love, a way that enhances rather than diminishes, that expands rather than contracts, that brings out the best in both people rather than requiring either person to become smaller to make room for the other. Maybe he comes back, maybe he doesn't. But here's what Jung would want you to understand. That was never the point. The point was never to use your dignity as a strategy to win someone back. The point was to discover that your worth was never dependent on someone else's capacity to recognize it. The real power was never in keeping him. It was in keeping yourself. In remembering that you are not what happens to you. You are what you choose to become in response to what happens to you. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This moment, this choice to remain whole when someone else retreats, this is you choosing to become someone unshakable, someone who loves deeply but doesn't lose herself in the process. In a world that teaches us to find ourselves through others, you chose the revolutionary path of finding yourself through yourself. You became your own anchor in the storm of someone else's confusion. And that anchor, once established, becomes part of who you are forever. This isn't a story about manipulation or strategy. It's about transformation. The transformation that happens when you choose self-respect over self-abandonment, when you choose presence over performance, when you choose to trust the process of genuine connection, even when it doesn't look like what you expected. Whether he returns or not, you've changed. You've proven to yourself that you can love without losing yourself, connect without consuming yourself, remain open without becoming empty. That's not just attractive to others. It's the foundation of a life lived from your authentic center. Your response to his retreat sends a message that reverberates far beyond this one relationship. It says to the universe, to your future self, to anyone who will share your life, I am not available for relationships that require me to abandon myself. I am not interested in love that makes me smaller. I choose connections that invite me to become more myself, not less. This message, once sent clearly through your actions, begins to attract people who are ready for that level of conscious relationship. People who don't see your strength as a threat, but as an invitation to be strong themselves. People who don't need you to be small, so they can feel big. And that's why Jung would say, you become unforgettable. Not because you played a game or executed a strategy, but because you remained true to something authentic in yourself. In a world full of people wearing masks, you became a mirror. Not a mirror that flatters, but a mirror that reveals truth. You reflected back to him the possibility of being loved for who he actually is, not who he performs to be. You showed him what it might feel like to be with someone who doesn't collapse under the weight of his humanity. You offered him a glimpse of what secure love could feel like. That glimpse, once experienced, becomes a reference point. Every other connection gets measured against that feeling of safety, of being seen without being consumed, of being loved without being possessed. If he comes back, it won't be because you waited for him. It will be because he grew toward the possibility you demonstrated, the possibility of love without loss of self. And if he doesn't come back, it will be because he's not ready for what you're offering, and that's information, not rejection. Either way, you win, because you've learned to love in a way that honors both yourself and others. You've learned to connect without consuming, to be intimate without being invasive, to be present without being desperate, Jung spent his life studying what makes humans whole, what allows us to become who we're meant to be, and what you've done, choosing yourself even in the midst of longing for someone else. This is the work of wholeness. This is the path of individuation. In a world that will constantly invite you to lose yourself in pursuit of others, you learn to love from overflow rather than emptiness. You learn to offer your presence as a gift rather than a demand. You learned that the most magnetic thing you can be is unapologetically yourself. Take a moment right now to appreciate yourself for choosing this path, for being brave enough to love deeply but not desperately, for being strong enough to stay when someone else retreats, not because you're waiting for them, but because you're committed to your own growth, regardless of who witnesses it. This is the gift Jung offers us, the knowledge that we don't need anyone else to complete us, but that we can choose to share our completeness with others who are doing their own work of becoming whole. And that choice, to love from wholeness rather than wound, to connect from strength rather than need, to remain yourself even when everything in you wants to become what someone else might want. That choice is what makes you truly unforgettable. Not because you manipulated a return, but because you demonstrated what return to self looks like. Not because you played hard to get, but because you became someone worth getting. Not because you used silence as a weapon, but because you used it as a space for healing. Both yours and his. If this resonates with you, if something in these words feels like coming home to yourself, then like and subscribe to keep exploring what it means to love consciously. But more importantly, keep exploring what it means to be whole, to be real, to be unapologetically yourself in a world that will constantly invite you to be anything else. Because that, according to Jung, according to wisdom, according to the deepest truth of who you are, that is the beginning of all real love. Remember, you were never meant to shrink yourself to make room for someone else's comfort. You were meant to expand into the fullness of who you are and invite others to do the same. That invitation, offered through your very being, is what makes you impossible to forget.